If you ask me which is my favorite genre of book to read without skipping a heartbeat, I would say it is fantasy. I love reading fantasy books, and there is so much of them out there that you can never run out of them. You can keep reading and keep reading and keep being intrigued and entertained. So, today I will be talking to you about the innumerous number of subgenres that come under fantasy. So, let's get on with it. So, before getting into the details of the different subgenres of fantasy, we need to understand what is fantasy. So, fantasy is a, a part of a broader classification of literature called speculative literature. Speculative literature includes or encompasses of entities which do not exist in the real world and are not supported by scientific fact or recorded history. And those are things like krakens or dragons and aliens, vampires, Frankenstein, all these things. So that's speculative literature. So you can understand that horror and science fiction comes under the category of speculative literature, and thus fantasy also falls under the broader umbrella of speculative literature. And under this huge umbrella of speculative literature is another smaller umbrella of fantasy literature. So, what is fantasy literature? Fantasy basically is defined by magic and supernatural elements in its plot points, and that's what it makes it different from maybe horror or, say, for example, science fiction. So science fiction need not have a fantasy element or a, what do you call it, a supernatural element in it. And under this smaller umbrella of fantasy literature or fantasy fiction, you'll be surprised to find out that there are numerous amount of subgenres, and that's what we're going to discuss today about. So the first one in this long list of subgenres is alternate history fantasy. It's also called alt hist fantasy, or sometimes abbreviated as AH. Alternate history fantasy, from the name itself, there is a historical event and there is an alternate retelling of the same historical event. And I think the best example of this subgenre is what is it called? Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. So it is very famous. I think most of us have read it. I haven't read it yet, but I know that it falls under alternate history fantasy subgenre. And another good example is His Majesty's Dragon by Naomi Novik. So that's it. That's alternate history fantasy. Second fantasy subgenre in my list is Arcane Punk fantasy. Arcane Punk fantasy are usually set up in worlds where science and magic systems are very well advanced and they exist together, but not harmoniously necessarily. There might be conflicts between the two systems or people who practice the two systems. Even though it is advanced, it is accessible to most people. Most people can use the technology and most people can conduct some level of magic on their own, even though not everybody is an accomplished scientist or a fantastical wizard, but people are aware that science and magic exist. Now, what is not Arcane Punk is that they both exist but they do not interact with each other. So if there's a storyline like that, then it's not Arcane Punk. They need to interact with each other. They should not exclude each other or ignore each other in the plot lines. The science that is existing should be sufficiently advanced. Now, if it is not sufficiently advanced, it is not Arcane Punk. That means if you think about folk tales and if there is some kind of scientific element of, like, for example, pulling water from the well, that's not considered as a great scientific technology. Or wheel or fire, they are scientific advancement in some sense, but it is very archaic. It's not that well advanced, so you can't consider those kind of literature as Arcane Punk literature. or arcane punk fantasy. And the third kind of fantasy, which is not an arcane punk fantasy, is where magic exists, but it is kind of unknown, and it is kind of a secret, like in the Harry Potter world or in Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Not many people know about these things exist, like vampires exist, or the wizards exist. Those are not arcane punk. So that was the second subgenre. Next one in the list is assassin fantasy. So you know what it is when you hear the name itself. So basically, there is some kind of political turmoil that is going on inside a country or between countries, and there is an assassin sent to kill someone important, and then this assassin himself is not a black and white person. He is morally gray, and we go through, or we experience along with the character, his morally gray journey of self-discovery and whatnot, along with a lot of crazy fight scenes and assassination scenes. So that's basically assassin fantasy. The best example of this, I think, is the Farseer trilogy by Robin Hobb. I'm yet to read it. I have the book series with me now, so I'm really looking forward to reading that. Next up in the list is Christian fantasy. So Christian fantasy, when you listen to the name, is Bible a Christian fantasy? No, it's not. It's a religious textbook. Basically, Christian fantasy has a lot of Christian imagery, ideology, themes, and even names are sometimes borrowed from the Bible. So there is also reference to a fatherly, godly figure sometimes in the plot line. Also, there is allusions to Christ in some way or the other. In the plot, you will also see reference to hope and compassion and resurrection, and you will also see savior like characters. You will have a lot of parables and miracles reference to. So these kind of elements is what makes a particular fantasy fiction Christian fantasy. Now, one of the best example of Christian fantasy is Chronicles of Narnia, and also Lord of the Rings. Tolkien had very clearly told that Lord of the Rings is definitely a Christian Catholic work, and even though we do not see any kind of religious theme directly in the story as we progress through it, like for example, hobbits do not have a religion, they do not follow any kind of religious cult or do not pray to a particular deity or anything. However, you will see references to a Christian imagery. For example, Silmarillion has a clearly reference to a creator which is named Eru, and also a fallen angel, Melkor. Also, Sauron is also considered an agent of Melkor. Tolkien himself was a practicing Christian person, so it's very easy to understand he might be influenced by Christian themes. It's interesting that when you first read it, you might not realize it, but when somebody hints at this, or when you come to know that this is kind of a Christian fantasy, that's when you realize that there are so many elements of Christian imagery in this masterpiece of literature. For example, throughout LOTR, evil is considered a distortion of a previous goodness that existed earlier. Just like you had a Garden of Eden, and then you have the corrupted humanity because they clearly disobeyed a kind of rule of law that was set by the Almighty God. You have fallen angels, so Lucifer is a fallen angel, and then you have Melkor and Sauron, who can be considered as fallen angels. Then you can see that orcs are kind of a distortion or a corrupt version of the elves, and Gandalf can be thought of the prophet. What else? The Black Riders, right? Black Riders are kind of wraiths of human emperors or human rulers. These are kind of good becoming evil, a kind of similarity that we can draw from Bible stories in Lord of the Rings specifically. So that's Christian fantasy for you. Next up is a very common and very popular form of fantasy subgenre, which is Bildungsroman or coming of age fantasy. So basically, you have a character, a central character. So basically, you have this very young central character, and you along with this character uh, go through their formative years, and from childhood to adulthood. Basically it is a spiritual and moral journey, and during which there is a transformation which is happening because of different experiences the central character faces, and that's what the whole coming of age fantasy series is about. And I think the most famous one is Harry Potter, and more recently the Kingkiller Chronicles, and then you have the Earthsea series, Farseer trilogy. All these are and can be considered under coming of age fantasy series. Next up is Crossworld fantasy. So basically, we have this central character which is living in our normal, real, boring world, and then suddenly he or she is transformed or taken to magical, strange land, and that's where the story happens. The best example for this kind of story would be Alice in Wonderland, or more recently, I think Neverwhere by Neil Gaiman is also kind of crossword fantasy book. Then comes heroic fantasy. I don't think you need much explanation here. So you have a hero or a heroine who is a central character. Nowadays you will see morally gray hero characters and heroine characters, but earlier it used to be mostly good characters, you know, these quaint and saintly characters, and they are pushed into certain situations and responsibilities because of some kind of destiny or power that they have within them, and they are reluctant in the beginning, but then once they realize that it's their path and destiny, then they get into it with full heart and save the day. That's what heroic fantasy is all about. Example, I think Mistborn series by Brandon Sanderson, the Brandon Sanderson, and yeah, the Earthsea Cycle series is also a great example of heroic fantasy. Next up is historical fantasy fiction. Now, as the name suggests, basically the premise is set in some kind of historical city and historical events surrounding it, and in real, you know, historical time period, and there might be real historical characters also in the story, but obviously there are fictional characters as well. I think the best example for this kind of fantasy would be The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arton, and it is based in 14th century Russia. And another example would be The City of Brass by S.A. Chakravarti, which, by the way, is my next read. I'm so looking forward to it, and it's the first book in the Devabad trilogy, and I will let you know what I think about the book once I finish it. Now that we are in this genre, I wanted to mention a book or a book series which is it's not fantasy, but it is historical fiction, but I love those books so much, so I'm going a bit off track here. It is the Falco series by Lindsay Davis, and basically it is kind of a crime investigation thriller based in ancient Rome, and follows this guy called Falco who is investigating these crimes. It's really interesting. Again, it's not fantasy fiction, but I'm just recommending it because it falls under the category of or the subgenre of historical fiction. Steampunk fantasy. This is a juxtaposition of the ultra modern with the antique. So you will have this ultra modern technology introduced with the aesthetic of, you know, the industrial revolution. So kind of retro future kind of a feel when you read that book. That's what steampunk fantasy is all about. It is a very popular subgenre under fantasy, and I think 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea would be a great example, or The Difference Engine would be an example of steampunk fantasy. It has its own kind of niche fan base. I am not particularly a fan of it, but I know that there are a lot of people who are just stan this subgenre. Swashbuckling fantasy, very popular fantasy. From children to adults, everybody love this subgenre. So basically you have this very daring, brave protagonist who is, out there, very adventurous, want to save the day, and sometimes they are not always on the right side of the law, but still morally they are always right, like to the Three Musketeers and the Lies of Locke Lamora. All these are examples of swashbuckling fantasy. Even Treasure Island, I would consider, because you have this. Oh freak! I forgot the character's name. The one with the wooden leg. Yeah, they are all considered very morally grey, but at the end of the day, they save the day. So that is swashbuckling fantasy. Urban fantasy, very clear. So you have a very urban modern settings, maybe 19th or 20th or 21st century real world, and there are magical things happening in here. So the Vampire Diaries is a good example, or the Dresden Files, another great example of this subgenre. That's all I have to say about it. Magical realism is up next. So you have this very realistic story or plotline that is progressing, and all of a sudden you come across some magical elements, and then you suddenly realize, or sometimes it's on the face and you realize that, hey, this is not just another novel, there is magical elements in this. So that's called magical realism, and this is not one of my favorite subgenre. Best example I think of magical realism would be the 100 Days of Solitude. And I'm sorry, guys, but I really tried to like this book, but I hated it. I tried twice to read this, but I couldn't just move past 50 pages. I just hated that book. So, yeah, I'm sorry about that. But another example of this would be The Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie, or Kafka on the Shore. So, yeah, that's magical realism for you. New weird or slipstream fantasy. Now this is quite new. I think this trend started off with the China Mivales, Perdidos Metro Station. I think that's the most famous new weird fantasy out there. So basically this fantasy has whimsical characters, bizarre plot lines, unresolved endings, and chronological conundrums. You do not know what is happening when, and it's absolutely weird. And that's what new weird fantasy is about. For example, I think in Perdidos Metro Station you have giant spiders with hands of humans. Along with humans you will find cactus people and water goblins and humanoid insect women, all these kind of beings living together and communicating using pheromones and mandible sign languages, etc. So that's how quirky and whimsical the new weird fantasy is about. I haven't read many, but I think the closest that I have ever experienced is the Dirk Gently's Detective Agency, that series. If you have watched it, if you haven't, watch it. It's really whimsical. It's hilarious. You should watch it. I think that's the closest I came to that. Or I think no, I've always felt that freak. What was that? I think A Wrinkle in Time. I always felt like kind of new weird fantasy. I don't know. What do you think? But I really felt that it is kind of quirky. That's new weird fantasy for you. Then comes Wuxia fantasy. So Wuxia fantasy is basically based on Chinese literature, and Wuxia literally, I think it means martial heroes. So basically there are characters who are experienced, who are experts in martial arts, and they are fighting for whatever reasons, and they do not answer to any kind of authority, and the main theme most of the time is personal freedom, basically the main characters are considered symbols of personal freedom, and that is wuxia fantasy for you. I think in modern times Jade City is an example of wuxia fantasy, and there are this Cradle series by Will White also is considered a wuxia fantasy. And of course there are lots and lots and lots in Chinese literature that you can find which fall under the classification of wuxia fantasy, which I haven't read. I am not an expert to point you out to anything, but you can Google it. Next is allegorical fantasy. Allegory, of course, you would have understood. I don't need to explain. So basically, this story is kind of a metaphor for something that's happening in the actual world, the real world, from where we can learn certain life lessons or moral lessons. I think the best example would be The Alchemist. And if you haven't read it, guys, dude, please, you don't deserve to watch this video. Just go and read the book, and because that's a book that anybody and their mother has read. So please go and read it. Then you have dark fantasy. No, not the biscuit from IDC, but this is a subgenre of fantasy, and it's kind of very popular as well. So basically, the landscapes are dark and frightening and sometimes horrific, and there is gloomy undertone in terms of plot line. And the best example for this would be The Dark Tower by Stephen King. That's all I want to say about dark fantasy. It's self-explanatory. Last but not least is the grim dark fantasy. Now, again, like the name suggests, the settings and the world building and the landscape would be grim, and then you have the characterization and the style, which is dark. So grim dark fantasy, and there could be a lot of murders and bloodthirsty people fighting with each other without remorse, killing each other, and it is, yeah, life is really gloomy and unforgiving and unjust, and that's what grim dark fantasy stories are all about. And I think the best example of that would be A Song of Ice and Fire. It actually falls under many categories. I mean, most of the books that I have listed down here definitely falls under more than 3 or 4 subgenres, right? It's all interlinked. A Song of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones series by George R. R. Martin is mostly considered a kind of a political fantasy, because there is a lot of political turmoil and betrayals and things like that happening in there. But again, it's grim dark. But if you think about the theme, you know, the heroes are always being killed, and there is a lot of gore and bloody wars, etc. And there is no such thing as hope, or or promise of hope as such. Evil might win anytime. You don't know what's going to happen. It kind of juxtaposes itself with a Lord of the Rings, because Lord of the Ring is strewn with lavish and beautiful landscapes and settings, and you have kindly hobbits and elegant elves. And then you take A Song of Ice and Fire, the landscape itself, sometimes it's harsh and brutal, and they have extreme weather conditions, and then you have famine, and then you have what do you call that, mental instabilities among people, and you can never trust anybody. You never know whom to trust, and there is murder and betrayal and what do you call that, all kind of dark elements in it. It's funny that George R. R. Martin considers Tolkien as one of his biggest influences, but then he built a world which is so much opposite to what Tolkien himself created. So yeah, that's grimdark fantasy for you. And like I said, the best example is A Song of Ice and Fire. And another example would be the first Law series by Joe Abercrombie. I haven't read it yet. Again, I have ordered the trilogy, and I'm gonna read it this year, hopefully. So yeah, those were my list of subgenres. This list do not cover everything under the fantasy genre. There are more than 50 subgenres that people have listed under fantasy series, but the ones that I listed here I think are the most important and most popular and common ones. And like I said, none of these books, or none of the fantasy series books, will fall under a single category here. Before I sign off, I want to also talk about low, high, and epic fantasies. So I know there is a controversy going on in the book lovers world that whether epic and high fantasy are the same or not. For me, I think they are the same, but people who think they are different consider it this way. So epic fantasy are series which multiple books, and you have to read through like 10 or 12 of books, to complete them. They are epic in nature, like what Steven Erickson's Malazan series or Robin Hobb's series, right? So they are epic in nature, like they are huge. And high fantasy, basically the definition is it happens in a completely new magical created world which did not exist here in the real world, and that's high fantasy. So the examples would be Miss Bond series, for example. Yeah, like I mean, I can name hundreds of them, but that's the definition of high fantasy. And low fantasy is like fantasy that's occurring in our world, so it's real world in earth, and then there are things that are happening. Example would be Harry Potter. So Harry Potter is low fantasy. So that is the definition of epic, low, and high fantasy. And so guys, thanks for listening in today. If you have ideas on what kind of videos I should make next, please let me know. Or if you have any suggestions on what books I should read and review, please please do comment, and I will read and review them for you. And yeah, this is me, Angela, signing off. I will be back soon with another interesting bookish video. Bye bye.